So, I think everyone's pretty much agreed now, Mark, that we all accept we have to do something. Mm-hmm. And a lot of organizations are either talking about it or genuinely trying to do it. But you at Aviva really have done it. You've gone all in on this. And I'd be really interested, because I think a lot of the audience are literally, how do I make this decision? How do I make this happen? What's the process? Like, who did you have to convince? All that. I think it'd be really interesting to hear that.
Yeah, so Aviva, 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, announced net zero ambition for 2040, which is the most ambitious of all the financial sector. I think it's fair to say there's a bit of a leap of faith in making such a statement. It has to be driven by the CEO. It has to be driven from the top. If it doesn't come from the top, it's not going to be done. It's not going to be a priority of the business. It's quite easy for Aviva, an insurance company, to say that climate risk is systemically important to insurance. If we can't insure buildings, cars, against floods and everything else, then insurance itself is going to be at risk. So the business risk is tangible. And so, there is obviously a massive business reason for doing so. But the belief has to come from people. And Amanda, when she became CEO, it was one of her things she wanted to make as one of her iconic, this is what we're going to do. And frankly, she rammed it through. And people like me on the asset management side, who I've got 40 sustainability experts, we were actually the ones saying, you can't do something, you can't say these things, because how do we get to net zero? We don't know how to do this for some of our assets. So we, who are sort of the sustainability champions, actually found ourselves slightly on the other side of it, sort of saying, slow down. This is because on the investment side, we have to deliver financial returns, and that's the number one metric for our customers today. Maybe it'll change in the future. But delivering sustainability is secondary to that. But we think you can do both. But the time frame is the important thing. And I thought the question was quite interesting, because it was about the next 3 years. And I was wondering what people were going to say about the next 3 years, because you could easily argue over a 3-year time frame there isn't any great particular need. And in fact, the world won't reward you. The financial world won't necessarily reward you if you go too fast and spend too much money, because your P&L will go down. And I think that's true. I think the problem for CEOs now trying to make a commitment is, if you just come out and do the leap of faith, then first of all, you're going to be having to deal with being called woke. And there's just massive backlash in the sort of political arena for making statements. And then you're going to be called greenwashing, because you don't actually know how you're going to do it. We've moved on. It's all about transition plans now. It's about how you're going to get there. And then it becomes a much more nuanced, a much harder calculation, because you've actually got to have a plan. And this is where you then end up with 40 pages of caveats of what you actually will need in order to get to net zero. And just look, a great example for us is we have to hold UK government bonds because we have regulations that mean it's the most capital efficient, and we need to match liabilities, and government bonds do that. I'm not going to offset the UK government hitting net zero by planting forests or other things that I could do. I can't be accountable for the UK government bonds that I hold going to net zero. So that's just a bit of my portfolio that isn't going to get to net zero by 2040. Right. And so we have to be very clear when we announce our transition plans what net zero really means. And I think what you're now seeing is a lot of people focusing on emissions reduction targets with a specific time frame like 2030, which makes a lot of sense to me, because you can see that one. You can construct a plan. An ambition to be net zero is an ambition, and that's okay, but you just need to make it clear. It's an ambition. It's not an agreement. It's not, we don't want to be sued in the courts because we didn't get there. So we're going to have to put lots of caveats in and all the sort of other things we need to make it.
That's great. But I guess that's normal business. I mean, you obviously want to be highly profitable in 20 years' time, but maybe you won't be. It's a plan. It's an ambition.
Yeah, but I think, if our commitments are too onerous,
Yeah.
then no, you could be sued.
Right.
And we're seeing much more litigation risk
Yes.
happening across all waves of sustainability. So why not go after corporate directors who made commitments and then they didn't make them, they didn't meet them?
Good. We'll come back to that. So as a big investor, give us a sense of what your view, I mean, as you look at the sector generally, I guess property, but maybe hospitality if you can as well, that'd be great.
Well, I think the economy is very favourable. So I think from a financial lens, then it's a great sector to be investing in. I think we're in all kinds of different ways. I think from a sustainability lens, then there's a lot of difficult aspects within this sector that the sector is not in control of. So buildings, obviously the most obvious, and I know we were talking about that on the previous panel. But let's take a different property sector, so office. Actually, we're finding that if you take a brown office and you make it green, and you do it in a good location, it still has to be a really good location, so the property dynamics don't change. But if you take a brown building, you make it green, you can increase the rental value of the property because most corporates want to rent a lower carbon building. They also want a more energy efficient building because it's cheaper to run. So you can actually increase the rental value of property and you can actually increase the value of the property. So the capex versus return is a win-win. So I make money for my customers and I reduce the carbon footprint, and the corporates who rent the buildings have a lower carbon footprint. So that's great. So I think it works in office in certain locations. I think the question is, can you charge the premium? Can you to the customers? And here in that example you can, because I think the property cost is small for a lot of corporates. Yeah. So they will pay a little bit more because it helps them get to net zero. Now, of course, the risk, the big risk, and I guess the question, so I was wondering what people can say about the risk. The risk is, for this sector, that governments around the world say there's a carbon tax, and you all have to pay for emissions. And it's a fair price for the actual damage done to the world. So suddenly, the balance sheet has full internalized cost of climate damage. Now, as soon as that happens, then this sector will immediately fix everything because the financials will make sense. So that's the biggest risk that hangs over a sector like this. But I think the time frame is a long way away from where governments will find that politically viable to do so. And lots of people, including us, are lobbying for governments to bring in carbon tax or phase it in over a long time. What you need is the threat of it coming in. But I think other parts of the sector are very interesting. So the transport, I think that's pretty obvious that you can use more electric vehicles, you can have more electric charging points, changing your energy to be solar. That's probably the biggest opportunity for hotels. They have huge roofs, they have huge areas of carports, you could have solar. And actually we finance the installation of those, and we rent them to the sector. So you don't even have to pay for it up front. You can allow people like us to do. So we want a return on it. Obviously, it's all for financial return. But there are many other ways of doing it. But I think the critical point, and I'm preaching to converted here, is if you can make the buildings more energy efficient through all the various ways of doing so, you make it cheaper to run. And that's how you win here, because then you can pass on the cost saving to customers and you will be the winner. So that's the opportunity I'm assuming people are talking about.
Cool. And just on the lending side, do you incentivize people to do sustainable things through your lending framework?
We do. We have a transition loan framework. So we actually give a lower price for people who are committing to reduce their carbon footprint. So literally the price of the borrowing goes down if you deliver. By
roughly what? I mean, is it huge, small?
It's probably, so let's say you're paying 3% above base rates, then it'll be reduction of 0.3%, something like that maybe. It depends.
On a big loan, that's a lot.
Oh yeah, oh no, meaningful. We also have rental clauses in some of our buildings that there are green requirements that have to be made. And we're doing a lot of things about solar, as I said, and electric vehicles. So.
So if it's all so good, why isn't it happening quicker? Like, what do we? I mean, you and I had a bit of a chat about this before, but what are the systemic constraints here? Like, why aren't we all rushing to go and do this?
Man, I think if, as I said at the beginning there, if the capex was spent to reduce the carbon footprint to make buildings be net zero or the whole operation be net zero, then a lot of companies would become unprofitable or would stop growing. And then the financial returns dry up, and then the finances don't want to buy, and the share price goes down. And most of the people who are making these decisions are incentivized for the share price to go up. So it's not going to happen. And I think that's okay. I think that's how the world works. I think instead you have to look at the easier to fix things, the cost of running an operation, make it as efficient as it can. That's the first thing to do. I think the second hardest thing is how do you charge a green premium to customers? Because, and I know that was mentioned before, I think, is a net zero room gonna get a higher price? And I don't think it does today. And I think, but how do you make that be an experience? How do you, if the whole hotel is an eco hotel, then I sort of get it. Like there's maybe a, but I think if it's not, then I find that pretty hard to do. Now, how the electric vehicle industry is sort of shifting is instead of talking about electric vehicles as being to save the planet, it's about they're faster, they're smoother, they're nicer to drive, they're really cheap. You don't have fluctuations in oil prices to deal with. So it's a different, and I think almost the whole of sustainability is now moving away from the risk to the opportunity or the benefits. Yeah. And somehow we need to
and that's very much the American approach in Biden's Act, isn't it? It's to incentivize.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm in a US pitch and I'm talking to investors in the US and I mention the phrase ESG, I might as well get my coat. I mean, literally, it's tumbleweed moment, right? I mean, it doesn't matter which state it's in. It's not a phrase that will help you win any business in the US. But if you talk about investing in climate solutions, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's the hydrogen market, whether it's agriculture that is sustainable, whether it's from solar right through to changing steel to be green steel. Right? People love it. It's thematic investing. Right. It's got a great return opportunity. It's diverse from everything they're invested in. It creates jobs. That's how you do it. It's the same thing. It's just not a risk lens. It's an opportunity lens.
Yeah, great. Good. So we asked the right question.
That's right.
Again, what you're talking about, which is great, is real action on the ground as opposed to a lot of talking and, I mean, just talk more about that. Why do we have all this virtue signaling? Because there is a lot of virtue signaling, still greenwashing. We all know that, and some of it's inadvertent. Sometimes I don't mean to do it, but there is a lot of it happening. How do we get to more real stuff, really, and actually faster? Yeah,
it's the classic. Taking your rubbish off your lawn and throwing it over your neighbour's fence and declaring a fantastic, beautiful garden, right? Exactly. We see it in the energy sector a lot. We've seen energy companies selling their brown coal mines off to private equity and then declaring huge carbon emission reductions. And obviously, we haven't changed the planet at all. We've done nothing for sustainability. And I think this sector will be doing a lot of that. It'll be looking at assets that are going to be stranded. They're going to be under flood risk. They can't cope with the weather. The people won't want to go there anymore because there's no coral, there's pollution, all of those. So we're going to see a lot of selling of those assets. And that's really good financially. So I'm not going to say don't do that, because probably financially that's exactly the right thing to do. But just don't call it that you did that for green reasons, or then declare victory on sort of carbon reduction. I think it's that's what will be called out. And you're not going to get through my sustainability team. This is if they're looking at the share price, they're going to see that. So you're not going to get a green light because of that. I mean, in fact, probably the best investment strategy we could do is buy brown, make it green, sell it for a premium, and then buy brown, make it green, sell it for it doesn't matter what it is. Any asset class in the world, you can actually create a value by making something green. So if I did that repeatedly, I would always have high carbon emissions because I would always have brown. But my emission reduction would have been massive over time. Right. So we need to actually talk about this a bit differently because net zero is just a bit of nonsense, really, because actually we need to reduce carbon, not necessarily get to net zero.
Yeah. Good. Great. So, I mean, there's definitely a difference between what I call financial time, which is quarterly, annually, and environmental or cultural time, which is 25 plus years. Just go a little bit further, somewhere in the middle, so longer term, let's say. How do you see this kind of panning out? What are the risks from an insurance perspective, from an investor perspective?
Yeah, so the risks are going to happen miles before the climate change happens because at some point the reinsurance companies who take away a lot of risk from people like Aviva, they're going to say, we don't want any more climate risk. And that will just fundamentally change the entire insurance sector because suddenly you won't get insurance for an asset that could be stranded or in certain geographic areas. You won't get insurance for director and officers' liability for the claims you're making about becoming green. You won't get insurance for pollution that you're creating in rivers. And so I think what will happen, and it's already starting happening, frankly, is really hard to get insurance in Florida for a lot of buildings. Actually, suddenly insurance won't come. And if you can't get insurance, you then can't get finance. So that's the immediate consequence of no insurance. So governments are going to have to get involved to help and probably to backstop some risk. Because it won't be economically viable for insurance companies to do certain things.
Which is happening in California at the moment.
It is, yeah, absolutely. Now, I speak to some US politicians, they actually quite like this because they want finance to cause the uproar in society, which will then actually help to fix the climate damage, because they don't want to do it politically. But actually, it'll come through insurance first, and it's never really spoken about insurance. But actually, insurance will be the first cause of a lot of this change, and then it will be the finance sector, and then suddenly people will want financing clearly, and they will then put some plans in place. But then you can look at it from an efficiency perspective or a cost, and I think you have to make it work from a P&L, and if you can't get financing, well, that's part of the cost of the business. Right. So it's not just the cost of running how efficient. It's actually finance cost is one of the costs, huge. Right?
Absolutely.
And then I suppose there'll be the license to operate. So you'll get the planners planning permission. You won't get planning for something that's not going to be green. And I think that's coming in sooner. So that all the new builds will be forced to be high quality energy efficiency and so on. So that's already here, I think. But it'll go further around the world.
I think the personal one I think is really interesting too, because a lot of these purse string holders, as you were saying, are of a different generation. Perhaps they've only got 5-10 years in the business left. They don't maybe care that much. But if you take away D&O insurance, they'd all start listening in a big way.
Well, and making it personal is one of our tools as an investor. So let's say we want to influence how a company is operating, or maybe it's the remuneration of directors, then actually we will say you need to follow industry standard and put this process in place. If you do not, then we will not vote for the re-election of the nomination director, and so they won't get back on the board. And actually, they take it quite personally, because this is their livelihood. The board directors, this is their job. And if they get blacklisted, they don't get re-elected, actually that affects their future livelihood. So you can make it personal.
That's great. Good stuff. Right. Art, we've been having questions, I think. Can you see that, Mark? You can.
Yep.
Does Mark consider social factors to the same extent as environmental?
I think we will. I think today investors are much more focused on the E, and you can link that much more to the finances. I think the social aspect is much more about the license to operate, and increasingly that's becoming the case. We're refitting a building in East London, and to get the planning permission, we went through a huge process where we actually now have local communities coming in and having training in the building about and creating jobs and so on. So I think that's sort of almost becoming needed, but I still think it's a long way off. I think the just transition, as everyone refers to, which is if you're closing down a coal mine, you're gonna knock out an entire town of jobs. Well, that's not acceptable. So you have to find a new source of income. So hopefully you can, make the business into something else that can create jobs. Yeah. That's how you make the governments find it politically acceptable to actually put a carbon tax on, which it's not at the moment. It's actually swung the other way. It's now politically acceptable to go anti-green, anti-woke.
Well, speaking of the carbon pricing, if you like, one of the interesting, obviously, there's a lot of evidence that suggests until the polluter pays, effectively, it's kind of a hidden cost that everyone's trying to move around, in essence. But I think I'm right in saying, Corey, in your standards, the ISSB standards, isn't there a requirement for companies to report their internal carbon price that they're using for planning?
That is correct.
So that's going to be really interesting. So you're going to have to, as big companies, put out there what the price is. And just to give us perspective on this, in the compulsory markets, so the ETS, it's about 78 euros, roughly, over the last year, whereas the voluntary markets, offsetting, let's call it, buying supposed forests, is about €2.50. So you've got to choose somewhere between these two for all your planning purposes. And people like Mark will be going, they've gone down to €3. They're not really serious. Presumably that's what'll happen.
A lot of offset schemes aren't worth the paper they're written in reality. Right. But if they get you through a planning process, then I guess they'll be used. But that, that's not true carbon sequestration, right?
Yeah,
you need to actually find a carbon sink to do it.
To go back to the social side for a minute, presumably that'll affect demand in time. I think we were talking yesterday about this. Companies are already starting to say, unless you can reassure me on the following, we're not having our conference there, for instance. Presumably that'll start more.
Totally. I think, in fact, that's a good example of how this will come in much more before end consumer.
Right.
Because most end consumers are going to struggle with the concept of why I need a heat pump, when actually, I can't afford a heat pump.
Yeah.
This is where governments have so many levers. So they're going to have to provide the subsidies. They're going to have to put policy in place to say you have to have an electric vehicle at a certain date. You have to use sustainable aviation fuel for 10% of your fuel if you're an airline. Okay. So governments, it's not just about sort of bringing a carbon tax in. There's so many different policy levers they can use.
Cool. One more question here we've got. If we look at the hotel pipeline with presumably 6,000 hotels under construction, many are not planned as efficient buildings. Okay, so we're talking about the kind of refurbishment argument. I think Ufi is always saying something like 80% of the buildings that will be around in 2040 are already here. So this is a refurbishment problem, essentially. So we need financing. I'm not sure what the question is, really.
Well, I think it's saying what must happen to make buildings that are being built be environmentally sustainable. And it has to work economically. Yeah. That's the answer, because it's clearly not, because you'll build a building the cheapest possible way. You don't want to cut corners, but if it's too expensive to build, then you're not going to do it. Right. So it's easier in the office sector because you can prove the value add. I think at the moment it's harder in this sector. So the governments are going to have to come in and say you have to do this. Right. That's probably the only way it's going to happen.
Right. Okay. And presumably you're looking at things like the BREEAM standards for certifications for good buildings and all good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we strive to be sort of A and B on most of our buildings that we're creating.
Cool. One last question, Art. Is there another one? What's the role of carbon offsets in your decarbonisation strategy? You kind of touched on that already, Mark. Do you see problems in so? So
one of the most interesting things we're creating, I think I'm losing the microphone, is a carbon removal fund. But this is true carbon removal. So this is forestry. This is looking at technology solutions. So we've bought huge acreage in Scotland. We've got 2 different sites. We're building, I think it's 130,000 carbon tons that we're offsetting. through that. But it's a big project. But we're going to bring clients along who want to actually use that. And there is an economic value to it too, because first of all, the price of carbon is going to go up. But also, these forests that you're building, you do actually farm them. Right. So they're not just leave alone, but you farm them. But then you have to make sure the wood that comes out of them is used in building construction, for example, where it's actually not straight burnt. So as long as there's good usage of the wood, there is actually quite a big cycle that can be created. Right. So I think that's how we're seeing the true way to offset.
Yeah, good. And presumably this fund will be around for direct air capture and carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not, at the moment, it's not scalable, it's not economic viable, but it will be. Yeah. Or we hope it will be.
Very good. Mark, thank you very much. That was brilliant.
Thank you very much.